This is our second of 5 sessions looking at the book of James. Tonight's, Monday, March 14th. And looking forward to a good conversation as we look at James chapter 2. Before we get started, I want to talk briefly about the format. Obviously, we're entirely on Zoom right now. I believe the Responsible Building Use Task Force is meeting again later this week, and depending upon what happens with that, there's a possibility we might try to go to a hybrid format for future meetings, which would mean we would still be on Zoom, but if people wanted to meet at the church, we would perhaps meet in the classroom there. So I'll send an email about that if things change, and if it seems wise to me and to others to try doing that again. So I'll let you know, but otherwise we'll certainly be back here on Zoom next week and on the following weeks. The other thing I wanted to say kind of by way of announcement is just I'm going to put in the chat here, a link to a document that has the reflection questions for later. So if you want to have access to those, or if you want to take those with you. But also in that document, I've reproduced the full text of James chapter 2. So if you'd like to have the text in front of you or follow along, if you click that link in the chat, it should open a separate window for you, which will then allow you to follow along in that way, if you like. Sound good? All right, perfect. I'm going to then, what am I going to do? I'm going to begin by sharing my screen here and putting some text up, and I'll go back and forth between the text and me. So here we are, week number 2. Oops, and already I've messed up. There we go. Week number 2, then looking at the book of James. Like I said last week, James divides nicely in its 5 chapters. So each week we'll look at a different chapter in the book of James. If you were here last week, or if you watched the recording from last week, or even if you missed last week, one of the things that we talked about was the way in which the book of James is quite heavy on commandments or imperatives, instruction. This is a book that doesn't spend a lot of time talking about who God is or who we are in an abstract way. It's very much an action-oriented book. It's got a lot of activity in it, or at least it understands faith as something that always is activated or is borne out by how we live our lives. And in some ways that's encouraging. In some ways that makes James a little more difficult for us to read. But as we get ready to launch into chapter 2, I want to show at least 3 ways that I think that manifests itself in James. First of all, we're going to see tonight that James wants to talk about favoritism. He wants to talk about favoritism that we show to other people and the problems with that, if those lines of favoritism are drawn in unhelpful ways. It also talks about God's favoritism. So we'll talk a bit about that God actually does appear to play favorites, or does appear to have different views toward different people, at least according to James. The second thing that we'll see in chapter 2 is really a relentless focus on the God-given dignity of people who are disadvantaged. And James will talk mostly about poverty in this regard. And so we'll spend some time talking about that, why it is that that poverty for James is not just a question of not having a lot of money, but actually puts one at a disadvantage, perhaps culturally or socially, but maybe God views that differently. The third thing to note is that James will spend a lot of time in this chapter talking about authentic faith being something that's completed or brought to completion or brought to perfection or fulfillment by works, or the things that we do, the deeds that we perform. In other words, for James, faith is not just an intellectual thing. It's not just a commitment of the heart. It's also something that we act out in our lives. Holding these 3 things together, and some of the other things that we'll see in chapter 2, I think is a deep conviction in the book of James that people of faith have an incredible amount of power in how we conduct ourselves publicly. And what that means is the book of James is quite concerned about how Christians behave, not because James is about like moral scolding, right, or wanting people to be better all of the time, but I think James has a vision of the church or of people of faith gathering community, of having a tremendous influence for good or for bad out in the wider world. And I say publicly here, not because I want to diminish the value of our private lives. I'm simply talking about that James is interested in how we interact with our neighbors and how Christian communities enact the values that Jesus manifested, I think, in his own life and his own ministry. And so James sees both good and harm there. It's one of the reasons why I think this book has a strong sense of urgency. It's one of the reasons why the language is sometimes a little bit severe. James is perhaps guilty of maybe some dualistic or binary ways of thinking that everything's either good or bad or praiseworthy or blameworthy. We know that life doesn't easily fall into those neat categories all of the time. That we spend a lot of time between those poles where things are grayer or messier or a little bit more complicated. And I'm sure the author of James probably realizes that in some way, shape, or form. But part of the rhetoric of the book is to kind of really show this kind of singularity of purpose or the singularity of intention that the Christian faith is supposed to implant in us. So it's a book that, like I said, it's a book that's really focused on what it would mean for the church to try to live out the values that Jesus taught in his own life. That's why it's such a difficult book to put into practice. It seems that Jesus is an incredibly high bar. In my point of view, I personally would rather talk about ideas and would rather talk about, let's discuss things and figure out who's right and who's wrong. James is a book that wants this to be lived out in our lives. James is not a book for people who like to sit and ponder things for long periods of time, because James finally wants you to get out there and act. So much Christian theology goes the route of thinking and pondering and deliberating and wondering. James is one of the voices in the New Testament that says, whatever you do, don't forget to live, to conduct yourselves in particular ways. So it's one of the things that makes it a challenging book in my mind. So to dive now into chapter 2, I always need a bit of a running start before we jump into something, just to recall something from last week. These aren't the final verses of chapter 1, but near the end of chapter 1, James says this: be doers of the word and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they're like those who look at themselves in a mirror, for they look at themselves and on going away immediately forget what they were like. There's a sense of foolishness here, right? Somebody who can't even pay attention enough to remember what they just looked like when they looked in the mirror. But for those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing. James has a variety of ways for speaking about law in this book, and it's not always consistent. So here it's talking about the perfect law or the law of liberty. I think here what James is talking about is law as we understand it in the Old Testament, or maybe law could be considered a kind of shorthand expression for the Old Testament as a whole, or in particular Torah, right? The revelation of God, not just in commands, but really in the ways in which the Old Testament shows us God, laying out God's priorities for the human family, laying out a vision of justice, a vision of a merciful society, at least in some of the laws, not all of them, of course, but I think the better laws are trying to do that. So chapter 2 picks up this theme and now starts to expand it. Chapter 1 has a lot of themes that kind of come at us scattershot. Chapter 2 is much more of a focused argument, I think, talking about the importance of being a doer of the word and not just a hearer. So let's dive right in. James chapter 2 begins like this: my brothers and sisters, do you, with your acts of favoritism, really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? So first of all, that word favoritism is here. I mentioned to watch out for this, right? And so James is going to begin with an example of what favoritism might look like in practice. So this notion of doing the word and not just hearing the word now is focalized into a specific example. For if a person with gold rings and in fine clothes comes into your assembly, or literally the word here is synagogue, which would make sense for what appears to be a Jewish author writing to a Jewish community, that they might have understood themselves as still members of a synagogue. Synagogue wasn't yet a word that was understood in differentiation from church. So into your assembly. So if a wealthy person comes in with all of the marks of wealth in that society, right? Jewelry, fine clothes. And if a poor person in dirty clothes also comes in, and if you take notice of the one wearing the fine clothes and say, have a seat here, please, while to the one you is poor, you say, stand there or sit at my feet, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Rhetorical question there. That verb that's translated made distinctions is actually the same verb that appeared last week in chapter 1 and was translated as doubt, which caught some attention last week. And we spent some time talking about doubting. James says the person who doubts is like somebody who's tossed on the waves, like who's not anchored in any way. So interesting here, it's not, like any word in any language, it can mean a number of different things. And so here, that notion of making distinctions, the verb has a kind of a root meaning of being divided within yourself, which in some ways maybe what explains what James meant by doubting, or what maybe translators are trying to highlight when they translate that as doubt in the first chapter. But in this case, you're people who have become divided within yourselves, right? There's a lack of consistency that James says in what's going on. If you make these distinctions, if you see somebody with the marks of wealth and you see somebody with the marks of poverty, and you treat them differently, you treat them in ways in which perhaps the society would have had them treat. So then this rhetorical question, right? Haven't you made distinctions among yourself? Have you become judges with evil thoughts? It's entirely likely that many of the people in the audience would have read this and would have said, well, not necessarily, because to do that, right, to welcome the wealthy person with a nice seat and to ask the poor person to stand off to the side or to sit down at one's footstool wouldn't necessarily have been an odd thing to do in Greco-Roman culture, in the broader Roman world and the broader Greek world. So much of life under the Roman Empire was very much like categorized or stratified by class, by social class, social status. You could tell people's social status by the clothing they wore. You could tell their social status by looking at their hands and under their fingernails, looking for calluses, right? There were just so many ways in which Roman society promoted a sense of awareness of other people's status. And then a lot of the social norms were meant to make sure that people got what they, quote unquote, deserved. We wouldn't say that this is necessarily fair or a good way to live, but of course our societies have these same things. We're just maybe a little bit more subtle about them in terms of how we identify people, how we might size people up by their clothing or by other aspects of how they kind of present themselves in the broader world. So James is targeting something. He's targeting a kind of behavior that was actually relatively common, that points to some of the cultural norms that were pretty standard in the time. As well, we want to note that what he's describing here, what James is describing here, isn't necessarily something that would have been unusual for people in a Christian assembly, whether it's a worship service or whether it's gathering socially or gathering for a meal. We're not exactly sure what he means by assembly or synagogue. One of the things we can tell from the New Testament literature about the early church, or the church of the first century, is that it appears to have drawn people from a variety of different social classes. Not so much the richest of the rich, and maybe not so much the poorest of the poor, but certainly everywhere in between, it appears that the church attracted a variety of kinds of people with different kinds of means. And so we see this problem, what became a problem in a lot of New Testament literature, of people trying to figure out, how do you navigate that? How do you create a loving or a Christ-like community when you've got people from different social backgrounds coming together. Paul spends a lot of time fussing about this, especially in his first letter to the Corinthian church in 1 Corinthians. He talks about the importance of when you celebrate the Lord's Supper, not having the wealthy people eat first and eating all of the good food and then just saving the table scraps for the poorer members of the community. So it appears to have been a problem, especially in some Greco-Roman cities. So James is describing something here that is not so much just a weird hypothetical, but could have been actually something that different communities had to ask questions about. Where do we seat people around the table, for example, if they come from different social settings? Do we follow the wider world's norms and customs, or do we do something different? James is obviously arguing that showing distinctions is inconsistent with the community. So then James goes on, listen, my beloved brothers and sisters, hasn't God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom that God has promised to those who love God? But you have dishonored the poor. So let's pause there again. That's really interesting. James makes a pretty bold statement here. Hasn't God chosen the poor in the world to be rich in faith? So the chapter begins talking about the favoritism that we show in the way we treat our fellow human beings. And now we've moved to talking about God as one who might have a sense of favoritism as well, or at least a kind of preference for choosing the poor in the world to be rich in faith, for choosing the poor in the world to be heirs of God's kingdom. It doesn't necessarily rule out everybody else, but it certainly is a statement about divine preference, which is not there in every biblical book, but James, I think, certainly makes that case. If you're familiar with what's been come to be known as liberation theology, this is a theological movement with roots mostly in Latin America from the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s in particular. James was a really important book to a lot of those movements. These were mostly movements within churches, mostly around poor people and poorer church leaders that made the claim that God is on the side of the poor and that the church should be as well on the side of the poor. And that would involve certain political commitments, would involve certain advocacy kinds of commitments, a certain kind of solidarity among the church. Here's a place where a lot of the roots of that theology get drawn. So let me also just highlight something about that word. You've dishonored the poor. That sentence, you've dishonored the poor. James's claim here, or James's criticism, is less about being rude or maybe not being generous enough. It's about the problem of dishonoring. It's about treating somebody less than, not just because they don't have as much money as the average person might, but it's to dishonor somebody whom God has already chosen to be rich in faith. It's to dishonor somebody that God has already dignified with this promise of God's kingdom. In other words, the problem seems to be dishonoring people whom God has already honored. Certainly, poverty has a way of diminishing people in our social systems. That really isn't James's primary focus here. James's primary focus is Christians need to work to honor the people whom God honors. And in this case, that appears to be those who are disadvantaged. James goes on, is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you? This gives us maybe a little bit of insight into the people that James was writing to. It appears to be a group of people who have been oppressed by some, or at least are at risk of being oppressed. It appears to be an audience who's been summoned into court. James is referring perhaps to advantaged people in society who are even using the court system to further their own ends. And James is saying, you've been victimized by these people. Why are you now showing preferences or showing favoritism in a way to try to either earn their favor or in a way of trying to elevate their honor, right? Don't you realize what's at stake here? James will come back to this later on. In chapter 5, James will make references to broken contracts James will make reference in chapter 5 to laborers who are being exploited by the people who hire them. So this will come back as well. But right now, James is concerned about not just a church that shows favoritism, but as well, even like a court system that might be skewed to advantage the wealthy and the powerful as well. That final sentence then, isn't it they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you, appears to be kind of a roundabout way of talking about the name of Jesus or the name of God, right? That in some ways, the abuses of the powerful people in this society, James interprets as a kind of blasphemy, a kind of discrediting, or a kind of offending the name of God or the name of Jesus. So this paragraph, which very much looks like a way of saying be consistent, treat everybody equally. It certainly is about that, but it's also a paragraph that talks a bit about divine honor and where divine honor points to, and how important those who are poor are in God's sight. I make a big deal about that because we'll come back to that later on in the chapter when James starts talking about faith and good works. But let me pause here, and maybe somebody has a either comment or a question that we want to talk about. If not, I can keep going. I like to see your faces. When I share the screen, I can't see your faces and see who's fallen asleep or who looks angry. All right, I'll keep going then. How about that? Because we're only a quarter of the way through the chapter, and look at this, it's 7:25. So.
Question, Matt?
Yes, please.
So the concept of divine honor is new to me. Can you say more about that concept?
Of honoring?
Divine honor, as you
divine
said.
Honoring.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I switched it around and used the word dignity there for a little bit as well, which I think are similar things. Sociologists like to talk about the ancient Roman world, and before that, the ancient Greek world, as very much an honor-shame society. That honor is considered almost a kind of commodity, something that people try to accumulate to achieve standing in society. This is probably no surprise. This is especially true among men, that that one of the kind of a true manly man or a true masculine man in Greco-Roman society would do all that he could to preserve his honor, would not let anybody else try to dishonor him, especially somebody lower than him on the social ladder. And the inverse of that, or the reverse of that, is shame. When to be shamed is to have your honor taken away or to have your honor diminished. And the sociologists who talk about this say that these kinds of societies almost operate as if it's always a zero-sum game. Like, you can't generate new honor. You have to take somebody else's honor away from them. And so there are these kind of social games that get played around power, which have to do with political power, which have to do with economic power, and things like that, which, might sound more familiar than foreign when you think about any society. But so then to talk about God, I think, or to talk about dishonoring the poor, I think, is to try to take away or try to imagine that the honor that God has gifted them with is somehow not real, or is somehow to be discounted or to be taken away. It's to make this presumption that the honor that God blesses people with is not real, right? Or is up for you to take, as if you could take away one of God's gifts. Now, I don't think James is saying that God is giving honor to the poor so that they can get ahead in society, but it's this notion of how, again, divine favor or divine honor rests with those people. Does that fill it in a little more for you, Caroline, or does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. And it really piques my interest in those sociologists who you speak of, who, thank you. It's not a simple concept.
It's not. One of the ways of thinking about it is, like, every social interaction has the potential for a transaction. In other words, it has a possibility for a winner and a loser, which is a horrible way to think about society and getting along with your neighbor, right? But it's an image of a society that's kind of competitive, where everybody wants to preserve their place in the ladder. And in some ways that's, quote unquote, merely cultural. In some ways, the Roman elites almost designed their society like that, right? That it's a society that very much was kind of a pyramid shaped, where the people who held influence and who held power at the top did the best they can to preserve that. So when Jesus says things in the Gospels like, if somebody slaps you on one cheek, turn and offer them the other cheek as well, that's quite a thing to say in a society that where people try to guard their public honor so carefully, right? It's if he's saying, don't worry about preserving your honor, or if he says when he says things like loan money to people without expecting to be paid back, like that also opens a person up to be dishonored, right? Because then you're a sap, you're a sucker if people are going to borrow money from you and not be responsible to pay back. That there's, I don't want to make it sound like every single scene in life was like a mafia movie, but it's kind of that way of understanding how honor and shame, I think, worked in the Roman world. All right, let me move on to some more of James, chapter 2. So moving on to verse 8 then. You do well. If you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now James is referring to the law as the royal law. Another way of understanding this is the law of the kingdom, or the law that pertains to the kingdom, perhaps referring back to that kingdom of God language that was apparently so important in Jesus' ministry, right? One of the things he talks about the most, or maybe a better translation for that is the reign of God. So I think here what he's talking about, what's the heart of the law, or what's the law that's at the heart of Jesus' message. And here he quotes from Leviticus chapter 19, verse 18, which if you happen to attend church at Westminster or online yesterday, this was in the sermon. So that's fortuitous, right? From Leviticus 19:18, when Jesus is asked what the greatest commandment is, he says, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second commandment is like that, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, in 19:18. Jesus was not the first Jew to recognize the importance of those two laws. We know of other Jewish teachers who as well thought that loving the Lord your God and loving your neighbor as yourself were kind of these centerpieces, or kind of these, center of gravity in many ways of the Old Testament law. I should point out too that Leviticus 19 goes on, and later on in that same chapter, it says you shall love the alien as yourself. So it's both. It's not just neighbor in terms of kin or fellow country folk, but as well immigrants or wanderers, outsiders. So James, anyway, is saying you do well if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scripture, right? So James is in a sense agreeing. This is the centerpiece of the law. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you show partiality, there's that word again, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for all of it. That doesn't sound fair, but nevertheless, that's the argument, right? That if you fail at loving your neighbor at yourself, you are legitimately called a lawbreaker. For the one who said you shall not commit adultery also said you shall not murder. Now James is quoting from the 10 Commandments here. Now, if you don't commit adultery, but if you murder, you've become a transgressor of the law. I think we would all agree with that, just because you get all the laws right, it doesn't mean that if you break one of them, especially a severe one, that you've done something wrong. So anyway, James goes on. So speak and so act as those who are to be judged by the law of liberty. Right? Imagine yourself as liable to these things. Here he says law of liberty. Above he says royal law. I think he's referring to the same thing, although nobody is quite exactly sure where those terms come from. For judgment will be without mercy to anyone who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over, and I can't read that because I've got subtitles in front of it, but I trust you all know what that final word is. I'll look in my Bible right here.
Judgment.
Yeah, mercy triumphs over judgment. Thank you. So that's hard. That's at the end there, right? This promise of judgment, which we see, of course, in a lot of biblical texts. The point here, I think, is that, or the larger point here, is that favoritism or discriminating in our behavior based upon, trying to earn favor breaks the law of love, breaks that centerpiece of the law, you shall love the neighbor as yourself. And as such, it's also a sin against God, a sin against the one who gave the law. In other words, I think James is saying you can't raise the banner of the law of love. You can't say we're a people of love. We're a people who believe in loving your neighbor as yourself, because that's the centerpiece of the kingdom as Jesus understands it, or as Jesus taught. You can't do that and at the same time show contempt to another person, because James is saying, well, that just disproves your claim. Your contempt then disproves your claim here. So James is now going to unpack this a little bit more and talk about the importance of love, loving one another. But before we go on to the next part of James, I want to take a really brief interlude right here. Just to take a step back. Let me take a step back from James and talk about just the broader context of what we're reading here in the New Testament. I want to point out, which might be news to you or might be something you've heard many times before, that the earliest decades of the Christian movement, the earliest decades of the church, were a time of significant variation, discussion, and change. In other words, the period of time, that first century of the Christian church, which is when all the New Testament documents were written down, only 27 New Testament documents, only from a handful really of different authors. But what we see in those New Testament writings is variation. We see different Christians living out their faith in some different ways. We see discussion, we see disagreement, we see debate taking place among different Christians. We also see change. We also see the church living into new realities, new understandings of what their faith requires of them, and how their faith should be lived out. So what I like about that as a New Testament scholar is it's this constant reminder that we should expect from time to time to encounter in the New Testament writings, if not disagreement, at least certainly deliberation and maybe back and forth discussion. These were people who hadn't figured everything out yet. They didn't have an owner's manual. They didn't have a long legacy of the church to fall back on. I try to remind my students at the seminary, people who are training for Christian ministry, about this all of the time, just to say the church is always changing. The church always involves disagreement. The church always involves competing ideas about what the right way to live out a Christian confession of faith looks like. That's not a sign of weakness. That might be a sign of responsiveness to the work of God in our midst. It might be a sign of responsiveness to our neighbors and to their ideas and the various ways in which we come from different backgrounds and understand God at work in our own lives. So the New Testament also doesn't give us the full picture. I wish we had enough writings in the Bible to give us a really full picture of what Christian common life looked like all over the place in the Roman Empire, but it just doesn't. We only have occasional snapshots to look back on and to kind of build a sense of memory, to kind of build a larger picture. And so sometimes what we see in the New Testament writings is evidence of what I think were certainly larger debates or what were lively interpretive conversations. I say that, I take this little interlude only because I want to talk a little bit about how James differs from the writings of the Apostle Paul, because we're going to see that in just a minute. So to continue the interlude a little bit, let me talk about Paul just briefly. I'm just going to offer up a couple of passages from the Apostle Paul, different author, different books in the New Testament. Paul, in his letter to the people in Galatia, says, just as Abraham, going back to that figure from the book of Genesis, just as Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness, so you see those who believe, or those who have faith, are the descendants of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, declared the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, all the Gentiles shall be blessed in you. For this reason, those who believe, or those who have faith, are blessed with Abraham who believed, or who had faith. Paul here is quoting from two different places in the book of Genesis. One is where he says Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. This is when God says to him, count the stars. I know you're old. I know Sarah, your partner, is old, but trust me, you're going to have an heir and you're going to be the father of the mother of a countless number of descendants, which sounds crazy to Abraham and Sarah at the time. But Abraham nevertheless believes in God, believes or has faith in God's promise, and God reckons it to Abraham as righteousness. Also in the red there, Paul is quoting from Genesis 12, a different part, but another part where God speaks to Abram and says, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So there's language here of blessing, there's language here of belief and faith, there's language here of righteousness. Just to note that this is Paul's argument. Paul also, in the 4th chapter of his letter to the church in Rome, says this, and I'll just pull out a couple of verses here in orange, that Abraham believed God, it was reckoned to him as righteousness. That same quote, Paul quotes it again there in his letter to the Romans. And then down at the bottom, that the promise that Abraham would inherit the world didn't come to Abraham or to his descendants through the law, not through Torah, but through the righteousness of faith. In other words, one of the big arguments the Apostle Paul makes in his letters is that God justifies us, so that God makes us right before God, not through following the law, but through simply faith, through the act of Jesus Christ, that God comes before us. It's not a question of earning our way into God's favor, but it comes as God's free gift, which we experience, we participate in through faith. That is important background, because now when we go back to James, we're going to see that James has a very different take, or appears to have a very different take on the subject. So James is going to say this, again, continuing this argument about the importance of adhering to this law of love, of loving your neighbor as yourself. James will say, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but you do not have works? Can faith save you? You can hear Paul in the background probably yelling, yes, of course, right? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, right? Good religious language. This is the stuff that Jesus says in the Gospels to people, like go in peace. It's language of blessing. Go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill, and yet you do not supply their bodily needs. What's the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. See what's going on here now, right? James is saying, you can't just say you have faith and not be not be doing anything, not have any deeds that demonstrate that faith. It's a sign of dead faith. James will go on then. He'll say, but someone will say, you have faith and I have works. In other words, James has this kind of imaginary conversation partner, right? Somebody who's saying, well, you do it your way and other people do it different way, right? Some people say faith is all you need, and some people say that works are important. And James answers back, right? Show me your faith apart from your, show me your faith apart from your works, and I, by my works, will show you my faith. In other words, James is saying, I don't have to worry about talking about what I believe in. I just simply have to do deeds of goodwill. I simply have to do deeds of love toward another. And that should be enough to demonstrate that I'm also a person of faith. And now comes the sarcasm, right? Sarcasm is indeed a spiritual gift, in case you were wondering. It's a great tool for theology. He says, you believe that God is one, right? You might believe in your mind, you intellectually agree that God is one, that God exists, that there's no God but God. You do well. Even the demons believe and shudder. In other words, simply believing in God's existence, James says, isn't enough. You can be a demon, you can be a devil, you can be this evil creature and believe that. But where's that going to get you? Do you want to be shown, you senseless person, or literally, oh, empty man? It's a great Great thing to call somebody, I suppose. Do you want to be shown, you senseless person, that faith apart from works is barren? Wasn't our ancestor Abraham justified by works when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? You see that faith was active along with his works, and faith was brought to completion by the works. Let me pause here and say a couple of things. All those words in red there, faith, Abraham, justified, works, those are all words we just saw Paul using in other letters. And now James is using them as well. James as well is turning to Abraham as an example. This is fascinating, right? That the same Old Testament character, same Old Testament figure that Paul sees as a good illustration for understanding what it means to be Christian is also, James also says, is a great person to look at. But here, Abraham doesn't quote the same passage that Paul quotes. James refers to Abraham almost sacrificing his son Isaac on the altar, which comes from Genesis chapter 22, if you want to read that. It's one of the more disturbing stories in all of the Bible, where God tells Abraham to go and sacrifice Isaac, to kill Isaac, Abraham's son with Sarah, his wife. And God seems to command that as some kind of a test of Abraham's faith. Abraham, of course, obeys, gets Isaac all tied up, and just before he's about to kill him, an angel speaks to him and tells him to stop. And the voice then says, "Now I know that you fear God," essentially. It's a horrible story that seems to be suggesting that this is something that God might do, that God might require of somebody. Other people answer back and say this was a way in which the ancient Israelites made it clear to themselves and their neighbors that child sacrifice was not a part of their religion, although it was for some other religious groups in the ancient world. Who knows? That's for another class to worry about. It is a very disturbing story. I don't want to just pass by that. But it's also a story that gets remembered in a lot of biblical tradition as a sign of Abraham's great faith in God. And James then sees this as a work, as a demonstration of Abraham's faith. And James also sees this as not the opposite of faith, or not some separate thing. James sees this as, sees the act, the deed, the near sacrifice of Isaac, as something that brings his faith to completion. Another way of understanding that word is that brings faith to its full expression. Let me keep going then, and we'll stop and unpack a lot of this. This is the last slide. This is the end of James chapter 2. Thus, the scripture was fulfilled that says, Abraham believed God and it was reckoned as righteousness. Now is when James goes back to that same line from Genesis chapter 15. And he, Abraham, was called the friend of God. I highlighted that because later on in the book, in chapter 4, James is going to contrast friendship with God and friendship with the world. And again, one of those dualisms, James says, you're one or the other. Be a friend of God. So James is seeing in Abraham's deeds a kind of demonstration or a kind of full flowering of his faith. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. Interesting, Paul in his writings never says faith alone. He just says you're justified by faith and not by the law. James is answering back here. Likewise, and now James is going to turn to another Old Testament figure, Abraham a man, now Rahab a woman. Likewise, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she welcomed the messengers and sent them out by another road? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is also dead. Brief introduction to Rahab. Rahab is mentioned in the book of Joshua, second chapter of Joshua. This is the story of Joshua after the death of Moses, leading the Hebrew people now into the so-called promised land. They're about to go to war with the Canaanites and engage in a pretty brutal war. But before they do so, they send spies to go check out the land. And a couple of spies go to the city of Jericho and they end up in the home of Rahab, a woman who lives in Jericho, who's identified as a prostitute, who welcomes them, who gives them hospitality. And when they speak about, the spies are fearful. They're terrified of the Canaanites. They're all big. They're all strong. They're convinced that the Hebrew people have no chance. And what's remarkable about Rahab isn't just that she gives them a place to stay so they won't get caught. Rahab explains to the spies that she and everybody else is terrified of the Hebrew people because they've heard about what their Lord can do, what their God can do. Rahab's the only one in the room who seems to have faith in the God of Israel. And she's a very unlikely source of that faith because, well, she's not a Hebrew. She's an outsider. And so Rahab's role in the story is certainly one of building up faith, but also it's one of hospitality. Just like Abraham in his story, very much a person of faith, as Genesis tells his story, Abraham is also a person of hospitality. There's a famous scene where he gives hospitality to three men who are walking by, and these men tell him that Sarah will indeed give birth to their son, and Sarah overhears this and laughs. Thinks it's hilarious because of her age and Abraham's age. But just again, note both of these people are celebrated in the Old Testament, both Rahab and Abraham, not just for being people of faith, but for being people who show great hospitality to strangers as well. James then concludes, right? Just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead. In other words, faith and deeds are co-workers for James. That isn't necessarily a total contradiction with what we see in Paul's writings. I showed you some Pauline quotes earlier. One more verse from Paul. In Galatians chapter 5, Paul says this, that in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything. What he's talking about here is law observance. So don't get too hung up on the circumcision language here, which is, not the most inclusive word to use, I realize. What he's saying is neither law observance nor non-law observance is the real question. The only thing that counts is faith working through love, or faith becoming effective through love. In other words, Paul says something really similar. Paul never says that it's just about faith, and how you live has no bearing whatsoever on who you are. Rather, for Paul, faith acts itself out, or faith makes itself known or manifest through our acts of love. And that's James chapter 2. I do have a final slide there, which we'll come back to in just a moment. But let me pause here and stop talking and see if there's comments, insights, questions here about what James has to say. Anybody, go right ahead and unmute if I can't
Matt,
see your...
One question that I had was, clearly there was division in the early church about how quickly Jesus was coming back, right? Is he going to come back, any day now? And some said, no, we need to work for the kingdom of God right here, right now, and not wait for it. Was essentially James, basically the letter encouraging the growth of the sort of let's build the kingdom here and now movement?
That's a good question. That's a good question, because I hadn't really thought of it quite like that. But James does have a reference to Jesus' return being near, but it doesn't appear to totally drive the urgency of the book in some ways. You read Paul, and Paul says, like, to the church in Rome, he's like, I don't want to build up on a church that already exists. I want to start a new church. I'm going to go to Spain. I mean, Paul's the entrepreneur, right? He lets somebody else take the organization to the next steps. Paul wants to start new communities. And when Paul talks to the church in Corinth, he says, if you're enslaved, don't try to seek your own freedom. And if you're not married, don't worry about getting married. And he says, because the present state of this world is passing away. I mean, Paul sees, like, there's just no time to worry about this stuff, people. James, I think, has a bit of an urgency, but it's less about, I think here's the thing, if all that mattered to these people, if all that mattered to the early church was let's save as many souls as possible, then things like wealth and poverty wouldn't have mattered as much to them, I don't think. You see what I mean? But James, I think, like James never says though, feed as many people as you can. What James says is, for crying out loud, show dignity to the people that God says deserve dignity. But it's not the same kind of urgency where it's just about this kind of frantic rush to get conversions. And so I think James is more kind of a long haul. Let's build a reputation. Let's build values for who we are. Let's try to live those out, knowing that we're probably going to get criticized for it, or maybe we're going to suffer some kind of opposition for it. But that's authentic to who God has called us to be. Is that? I think I may be redefining your question, which might not be fair, but yeah. Yes.
Were Paul and James contemporaries? Were they? Was this an example of disagreement within the early church?
Short answer is maybe. It was. Were they contemporaries? We're pretty sure that Paul's letters come from roughly the years 50 to 60. So about 20 to 30 years after the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. If James was written by the actual James, the brother of Jesus, then it was probably written around that same time, probably around the year 50 or in the early 50s. Last week, we talked about, some have speculated that James might have been written later. And so some scholars say there's just too many coincidences here that both authors are talking about Abraham. Both authors are talking about that verse, Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. They said those couldn't be just mere coincidence. These might be two authors kind of arguing in their writings with each other. I think it's also possible that James is maybe not arguing back at Paul, but James might be worried that some people are taking Paul too far. In other words, some people might be so convinced that all that matters is faith, that what you do with your life simply doesn't matter. Do you know what I mean? That how you act doesn't matter. James might be worried that if Christians live a life that's too lawless or too undisciplined or too free, that the people who are going to suffer from that are going to be the poor among us. You see what I mean? And so it might be that James is trying to say, don't get too excited about what Paul calls Christian freedom. That freedom has to be lived out in our deeds, and those deeds should follow the pattern of Jesus in his own ministry, which was very much a ministry that I think recognized the God-given dignity of all people. So I'm personally am not sure that there's enough connection that requires us to think that this is like James answers back to Paul, for example. But I think it does show that these are topics that probably in the middle of the first century were being debated. Like, what is it, if you're a person of faith, what does that mean for how you have to live your life? Do we still keep the different kind of social status preferences in place that broader Roman society has taught us our norms and are the way in which we should live? Or do we start to organize our communities in different ways? And I think both James and Paul are pushing for a different set of Christian values to take root. They're using some slightly different language to get there. So I see Manley has raised his hand, and then Margaret I see as well, waving at me.
Pat, in terms of your classes of Lutheran, primarily Lutheran students at Luther, how does this discussion of faith and works play out in your classes?
Yeah, you're trying to get me in trouble, but yeah, if people don't know, so I'm a Presbyterian who teaches at Luther Seminary, and so most of my students, probably about 80% of them, are Lutheran. And Martin Luther, this was the part of the book that Martin Luther really did not like, because for Luther, Paul was the guy, and Paul's doctrine or Paul's belief that we're saved solely through faith and not by works was incredibly important, and indeed it probably is largely responsible for Protestantism as we know it. But and so a lot of my students come in with a bit of a bias against James that they've inherited, and they can't really explain why all of the time. I usually try to show that I think James and Paul are not that far off from each other. That I think, Paul does say, like that line from Galatians 5:6 that I quoted, that faith lives itself out through love, that Paul understands that Paul never says, just believe and then your actions have no consequence. I don't think Paul ever says that. I think Paul gets mad at some of the people he writes to that he thinks are being bad neighbors to one another. And I think James is never suggesting that faith doesn't matter. James is just saying, why are we having this argument? People who are people of faith are going to live that out in their deeds. And if people say they're people of faith and they're not living that out in their deeds, we have good reason to wonder whether their faith is authentic or not. That doesn't mean we start kicking people out of church. That doesn't mean we have such high standards for ourselves that we never make mistakes. But it also means, I think, for James, that we're very conscious of the way in which our claims of faith obligate us to a certain way of living in the world. So I try to tell my Lutherans that, Lutherans, it's not that Lutherans don't believe in doing good works. They just get really anxious if you try to suggest you have to. Not all Lutherans, but some of my students. So that's where I go. Yeah, Margaret, please.
Yeah, when you started this, you talked about a dualism. It's an either or kind of situation. You're either on top or you're at the bottom. You're either in or you're out. You're either honored or not. I don't know the philosophical theories of this type of the ancient world, but it seems to me we're contrasting with both and versus either or. I had a Japanese colleague in New York who said, when we get into these kinds of discussions, he would say, it's just the do theory. You do, you be, you do, you be.
There you go. Yeah, I think there is a way in which James is now collapsing it, saying, it's really all about, well, like he says, right? Through my works, I will demonstrate my faith. I think it's what James is getting at. The other thing I want to say there is some of these dualisms or these either ors, we see in a lot of other places too. So if you read the book of Proverbs in the Old Testament, it will talk about, here's the way of wisdom and there's the way of folly or foolishness. Right, there's two paths, there's two roads. Psalm 1 does a similar thing, right? About, there are good ways to live and there's dangerous ways to live. A lot of broader philosophy in the time in the first century, from the Greek world, from the Roman world, says similar things. Who's a true philosopher? It's the one who actually is able to enact what they say, what they teach, and so you can tell who the true philosopher is by if their actions are consistent with their teachings. The ones whose actions aren't consistent with their teachings and don't show the kind of virtue they call for, those people are probably charlatans. They're hucksters. They're out to get your money. They're out, we see these debates in society, and we still have these as well today, right? I mean, there are certain people you could watch on television, not on KMSP on Sundays at 1 o'clock, but other channels, late at night, that make you maybe wonder, this just doesn't sound Christian. This doesn't really measure up. And it's not just that, my point is, it's not just the church that kind of wonders about this and then kind of builds these either ors. But you're right, real life tends to be a lot more both and. Let me, I'm conscious of the time. I have just one more slide to bring all of this to a lovely conclusion. Just to kind of, you're wondering, where are we now? This discussion between faith and works, and this is really only in chapter 2. When we get to chapter 3, James will talk about other behaviors and we'll make other points. But in chapter 2, this discussion about faith and works, it's not merely academic, or it's not merely just abstract. I think in the bigger picture, the book of James is urging its readers, first of all, to side with individuals who are poor, to help them, perhaps, although there's not a lot in this letter about things like charity and gifts. But even more so, James is concerned that people recognize the God-given value of people who live lives of disadvantage. So just to note that. Like James never talks about the causes of poverty, for example, or James never talks about the importance of dismantling the systems that create poverty. Those are important things. Those are things that I hope we all care about, right? Thinking about the causes, the root causes, thinking about what makes poverty a trap for so many people. James isn't that sophisticated. It's going into those types of social questions and economic questions. James is just simply trying to say at this point, don't show favoritism that further disadvantages people. Part of that too is not to side with the values of the world. This idea of Abraham becoming a friend of God or allied with God. And then as well, I think James is concerned that the book's readers don't cheapen faith and don't corrupt religious language by appealing to faith or by appealing to religious language without backing them up with action. Remember that line where James says, if you see somebody who has no clothing and no food, and you say, go in peace, right? Be warm and be filled. What good is that? Like, it's as if James is saying, don't you dare utter a religious blessing to somebody without doing anything to help improve their circumstances when their circumstances are so dire. Right? Don't boast about being a person of faith without having some kind of action or some kind of commitment that backs that up. My Lutheran students would say, beware that you don't make this too legalistic. Right? They would say, don't tell people that they have to do things to earn their way into God's favor. I think James would believe that as well. I certainly believe that finally, at the end of the day, this is about a God who reaches out to us, who embraces us as we are. I think that James wants to remind us that that faith, that being seized by God, being embraced by God in that way, has implications for how we live. And that's always a lifelong journey. God only knows all the ways in which I fall short of these things on a regular basis. But maybe what James is saying is maybe what James is doing is urging a larger community to try to step into this, to do that together, because this work, the obligations, the needs are too much for any one person or any individuals to address on their own. Here are the questions I'm going to ask you. I'm just putting them on the screen here, so anybody watching on the video can pause the screen now and have questions for their own reflection. But and if people are cutting out tonight, I will see you next week.